A lieutenant colonel walked into Wellstone General Hospital like he owned every room in it, barking at clerks, shoving past orderlies, treating every person in scrubs like they were furniture that had been left in his way. Then he found the wrong woman standing between him and what he wanted, and he did something that would end his career before the afternoon was over. He raised his hand. He brought it down across her face, in front of her patient, in front of the cameras, in front of everyone watching. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked at him and said 7 words that should have made him run. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where the stories that never make the headlines come to live. Real drama, real tension, real people who got underestimated and made the world regret it. Smash that like button if you're already feeling this one, and drop a comment telling me your city and your country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The morning shift at Wellstone General Hospital in Calverton, Ohio started the way it almost always did, short-staffed, over-caffeinated, and running about 40 minutes behind schedule before the first ambulance had even pulled up to the bay doors. Claire Voss had been on since 6, not because her shift required it. She'd come in early to cover for Derek Malone, a night nurse who'd called out with a sick kid at home, because that was the kind of thing Claire did without being asked and without making a point of it afterward. She was 41 years old, medium height, with close-cropped dark hair threaded through, with early gray that she'd never felt the need to color. Her badge read Claire Voss, Level I Trauma, and beneath that, in smaller letters, Emergency Department. She wore standard Navy scrubs. She had a habit of rolling her sleeves to the elbow when the floor got busy. She moved through the ER the way someone moved when they had learned not in a classroom, but somewhere else, somewhere that made classrooms feel decorative, that wasted steps had a cost, flat. By 9:15, she was managing 4 patients. Bay 3 held a 63-year-old woman with suspected cardiac involvement whose morning EKG was making Claire uneasy in a way she couldn't fully articulate yet. Bay 7 had a teenager with a fractured wrist, scared and trying not to show it. Bay 2 was a construction worker who'd taken a nail gun bolt through the forearm and was handling it with the specific, stoic silence of a man who was absolutely not handling it. And Bay 5 held Russell Aldean, 58 years old, admitted overnight with acute respiratory distress that the team had stabilized but not resolved. Russell was the one demanding the most attention. Not because he was difficult, he wasn't. He was quiet and apologetic in the specific way men his age got when they felt like a burden, but because his oxygen saturation kept dipping into numbers she didn't like, and his chest X-ray from 7A. M had shown something ambiguous enough that Dr. Petra Navarro, the attending on rotation, had ordered repeat imaging at 10. Claire was at Russell's bedside, updating his chart, when she heard the voice from the front desk. It cut through the ambient noise of the floor the way certain voices did not, because it was panicked, but because it was accustomed to being the loudest thing in any room it entered. I need someone who actually works here, not a receptionist. Someone with decision-making authority. Claire didn't look up right away. She finished the line she was entering. O2 sat 91%. Patient repositioned, supplemental oxygen increased to 4L per minute, then capped her pen and stepped out of Bay 5. The man at the admissions desk was in his late 40s, broad through the shoulders, wearing an army dress uniform, with a lieutenant colonel's oak leaf clusters on the collar. His name tape read Aldine. He had both hands flat on the counter and was leaning forward over it in the way people did when they wanted their physical size to make the argument for them. Russell's brother. She'd seen it in the chart the night before a family member declined to visit last night, would come in the morning. She'd noted it and moved on. Janelle Okafor, the ward clerk on front desk, was holding her voice steady. She'd been doing this job for 11 years, and she was good at it. Sir, I can notify his nurse. I didn't ask for a nurse. I asked for someone with authority. an administrator. Someone who can actually change things. Sir, if you'll just... Do you understand what I'm asking? I want someone who can make decisions, not explanations. Claire walked to the desk. She didn't rush. There was no value in rushing toward something like this. She'd learned that lesson in contexts that had nothing to do with hospitals. Mr. Aldine, she said, my name is Claire Voss. I'm your brother's nurse. I can answer your questions. He turned and looked at her, and she watched him do the thing that certain men did. In the first 3 seconds, a rapid inventory, scrubs, age, gender, and then the quiet arithmetic that followed. The number he assigned her without asking a single question. I asked for an administrator. I understand that. I'm telling you I can help you. Can you authorize a room transfer? Room assignments are a medical decision. Dr. Navarro is your brother's attending physician. She can speak with you about... Then go get her, doctor. Navarro is with another patient. As soon as she's available, I'll let her know you'd like to speak with her. In the meantime, I can walk you through everything. Russell's current condition, his vitals, his treatment plan, and what we're looking for in the repeat imaging this morning. He studied her for a moment. Something in his face shifted, not softening, nothing that generous but recalibrating. He'd run one approach, and it hadn't produced immediate results, so he was adjusting. Fine, he said. The word came out flat. She walked him to Bay 5. Russell looked up when they came through the curtain, and his expression was layered in a way that told a small story relief and wariness together. The particular face of someone whose older sibling had always arrived with both help and complication, bundled into the same visit. Warren, he said. You look terrible, Warren, Aldine said, which somehow wasn't cruel, just blunt in the fashion of men who'd grown up in households where directness substituted for tenderness, and Claire filed it away. She walked Warren through the chart. Onset of respiratory symptoms. Vitals on admission and through the night. The current oxygen support and why it was calibrated the way it was. The morning X-ray findings and why the repeat had been ordered. She used plain language without being condescending about it. She'd learned years ago that explaining things clearly was not the same as explaining them slowly, and that most people, regardless of how they came through a door, understood more than they were given credit for when the information was handed to them straight. He interrupted her twice. Both times she paused, heard him out, answered directly, and continued. Why wasn't I called at 3 a.m. when his oxygen dropped? He said. Fair question. Looking at the chart, you're listed as secondary emergency contact after Russell's wife. She was called. She made the decision to wait till morning before reaching out to you. A pause. Margaret, I don't have her last name on file. She wouldn't have wanted to wake me. His voice changed texture briefly, the edge thinning out for a moment and then returning. That's beside the point. I should have been called. That's a conversation to have with Russell and with whoever he designates on his contact form. The hospital follows the hierarchy the patient establishes. He didn't like that answer. She could read it in the way his jaw tightened. What's the repeat imaging going to show? I don't have that information yet. What do you think it'll show? I don't speculate about imaging results before I have them. Worst case scenario? If you want to talk through worst case scenarios, I'd rather do that in the hall, outside Russell's hearing, unless he specifically wants to be included. Russell said, from the bed, with a tired half-smile, It's fine, Claire. He does this everywhere he goes. She didn't quite smile back. But it was close. Warren Aldine uncrossed his arms. For a few seconds, the conversation seemed to be settling the specific kind of settling that happened when someone's initial charge ran out of momentum and the room found a new equilibrium. Then his phone buzzed once in his pocket. He pulled it out, looked at the screen, and whatever he read there put the rigid set back into his face immediately, as if the brief softness had never happened. He put the phone away. I want my brother in a private room. That's not within my authority to arrange. Then get me someone for whom it is. I'll flag it in the chart and make sure Dr. Navarro is aware of the request when I see her. Not flagged. Done. I want it done. Sir, do you know what rank I hold? The question dropped into the room at an odd angle. Claire looked at him without hurrying her answer. Yes, she said. Your insignia is visible. Then you understand I'm not someone who waits around while things get flagged. I understand that's your experience elsewhere. In this building, your brother's room assignment is a function of medical necessity and bed availability. Rank isn't a factor in that calculation. This is a hospital. The silence after that had a specific quality. Russell had gone motionless in the bed. Janelle, who had followed at a careful distance and was now standing just outside the bay curtain, took a single, quiet step backward. Warren Aldine took 2 steps toward Claire. She didn't move. Her feet stayed exactly where they were. It was not bravado. It was something more like the complete absence of the instinct to retreat, an instinct that had been worked out of her somewhere else, in conditions that had no equivalent in this building. I have been patient, he said, his voice dropping in a way that somehow made it carry more weight than when it was loud. I have stood here while you explained things I didn't ask to be explained. You told me to wait for a doctor I haven't seen, and talk to me like I'm one of your problem patients. I am not a patient. My brother is. And you work for this hospital, which means at some functional level, you work for me. That's not how this works, she said. His hand came up fast. It was an open palm, the back of his hand, a sharp lateral strike across her left cheek, the kind of blow calculated to humiliate more than injure. It snapped her head to the side. The sound of it was small and enormous, at the same time a flat crack in the close air of the bay that seemed to reach every corner of the floor. Russell may sound from the bed that wasn't quite a word. Claire's head turned back slowly. She didn't touch her face. She didn't step backward. Her expression did something internal, a compression, a settling, like a decision being made below the surface that would not be visible until later. She looked at Warren Aldine for a moment that lasted longer than it had any right to. You have no idea who you're dealing with, say, she said. Her voice was so quiet, he had to lean slightly forward to catch it. Then she turned and walked out of the bay. She went directly to her locker at the nurse's station, retrieved her personal cell phone, not the hospital-issued one. The non-personal one she kept charged and kept separate, and she walked into the supply corridor off the main hall. The corridor was narrow and smelled like antiseptic and boxed gauze, and the security camera above the door had a clear angle on her face. She stood beneath it and made a call. It rang twice. It's Voss, she said when the line connected. Her voice was level. I know the hour. I need you to push something up the chain. A pause while she listened. Wellstone General, Calverton, Ohio. Yes, today. She listened again longer this time. Tell them I didn't initiate it. Tell them I know they've been sitting on this, and they can move if they want to, but I am not asking for it. I'm just telling you where I am. She listened once more. I know. I'll be here. She ended the call, stood in the corridor for 4 seconds. Then she went back to work. She found Sandra Yee, the charge nurse, at the central station. Sandra's face had the carefully neutral expression of someone who had witnessed something serious and was managing the decision of what to do about it with great precision. I need you to flag the Bay 5 camera footage for administration, Claire said. Right now, not at the end of shift. Already pulled it, Sandra said. Claire, I'm fine. Page security and have them post at the entrance to Bay 5. Russell stays comfortable and undisturbed. His brother does not re-enter without a supervisor present. What do you need? I need Dr. Navarro. Bay 3. I've been watching an EKG progression on Marguerite Etheridge since 6:45, and I don't like where it's going. Sandra looked at her for a moment, really looked, the way people did when they were trying to determine whether someone was holding together or performing holding together. Then she picked up the phone. Claire was at Marguerite Etheridge's bedside in 2 minutes. Marguerite was a retired school teacher from the east side of Calverton, 63 years old, who had presented overnight with what she described as severe indigestion that had kept her awake. 645 EKG had been borderline. The 830 strip had been worse. Claire laid them side by side on the tray table and felt the cold focus drop into place, the same focus she had learned in other rooms, in other years, in places that looked nothing like this one, and operated under entirely different rules. She picked up the internal phone. "This is Voss. I need doctor. Navarro in Bay 3 before anything else. EKG progression. I want her to see it in person." She stayed with Marguerite and explained, in plain and steady terms, what she was seeing in the strips and what was likely to happen in the next hour. Marguerite listened, the way older patients sometimes did, with the particular stillness of someone who had lived long enough to know when the person talking to them was not softening the information, and who appreciated that. Behind her, through the gap in the curtain, Claire could hear Warren Aldine's voice at the nurse's station. He had moved locations, but not intensity. He was demanding to know where the nurse had gone. He was demanding to know why security personnel were suddenly present on the floor. He was using the word authority again. She counted it 3 times in 90 seconds, and there was a new note in his voice now. Something that wanted to sound like indignation, but was starting to sound like a man who sensed the walls of a room moving inward and wasn't sure why. Dr. Navarro arrived at Bay 3, looked at the EKG strips Claire had arranged in sequence and said, without hesitation, "Get cardiology on the line." Now, she was already reaching for her pager with her other hand. "On it," Claire said. While she worked the phone, she tracked the floor through the bay curtain gap. Thomas Wren, the ER administrator, had arrived at the nurse's station, a 50-year-old man with the permanently uncertain posture of someone who managed crises by hoping they resolved before requiring him to act. He was in quiet conversation with Sandra, who was showing him something on her tablet. The camera footage, Claire assumed. Warren Aldine stood nearby. He had shifted, she noticed. The posture had changed from aggression to something that was trying to approximate reasonableness, the pivot that certain people made when they realized the end. The audience had changed, and that their previous performance was being evaluated by people who hadn't been in the room to see its start. Talking, explaining, gesturing, occasionally with one hand in a way that was meant to look measured. Claire hung up the phone and began preparing Bay 3 for a potential transfer to the cath lab. Thomas Wren found her there 8 minutes later. He came in carefully, like someone who wasn't sure the floor was solid. "Claire, I need 2 minutes. I have a patient who may be going upstairs in the next 15. Whatever you need administratively, I'll give you a full statement at the end of shift. He's requesting that you be removed from his brother's care." That's Dr. Navarro's call. He can make the request through her. He's also suggesting. Wren paused, chosen his words with the care of a man who didn't enjoy choosing words. He's characterizing this as a mutual altercation. That there was provocation. The camera footage will settle that, Claire said without looking up from the chart. Claire. Something in Wren's voice shifted slightly. He's a lieutenant colonel. She looked at him then. Directly. Tom. He's a man who assaulted a nurse on camera in front of a patient. Whatever he holds in the Army does not change what the footage shows. He is in your hospital, in your emergency department. You have a decision to make, and it is yours to make, and it has nothing to do with his rank. Thomas Wren stood in the gap of the curtain for a long moment. He was the kind of man who would eventually do the right thing. Claire knew he just needed to be pointed at it firmly enough. He nodded once, in the manner of someone accepting a burden, and left. She turned back to Marguerite Etheridge. Marguerite had been Etheridge. Marguerite had been watching the extension of someone who had spent 30 years in front of classrooms, reading the temperature of rooms for a living. "Sounds like you've got your hands full out there," Marguerite said. "We're going to take excellent care of you," Claire said, and rested her hand briefly over Marguerite's. That's the only thing on my list right now. The cath lab transport came at 11:14. Claire walked alongside the gurney to the elevator bank, gave the receiving nurse a complete verbal handoff that mirrored everything in the chart, and watched the elevator doors close. She turned around. Warren Aldine was at the far end of the corridor. The two security officers, Marcus Tully and Diane Fair, both of whom Claire had worked alongside for years, were positioned nearby with the body language of people who were not quite intervening, but were absolutely not leaving. Thomas Wren stood near the nurse's station. Dr. Navarro had surfaced from somewhere and was on her phone with the clip deficiency of someone managing 3 problems in parallel. Aldine looked at Claire from across the length of the hall. His expression had moved through its various configurations and settled now into something cold and deliberate. He was still working through something. She could see it in the set of his mouth. The way his eyes moved from her to Wren to the security officers and back. He was a man accustomed to having institutional weight on his side, and he was in the process of discovering that the institution in this building was not his. Claire returned to the nurse's station, picked up a chart, and kept moving. She checked on the teenager. In Bay 7 wrist had been properly splinted, pain managed. Mother had arrived and was sitting beside him with the exhausted relief of a parent whose worst fear had been downgraded to a manageable problem. She checked on the construction worker in Bay 2, whose forearm wound had been cleaned and dressed, and who was now arguing cheerfully with the resident about whether he needed a tetanus shot, which he absolutely did. She updated charts. She responded to 2 call lights. She did what she had always done, which was the work in front of her, because the work in front of her was what mattered, and because she had learned a long time ago that the way you held yourself in the middle of a difficult situation was the thing people remembered after everything else was sorted out. It was 11:47 when the elevator at the far end of the ER corridor opened. She heard it before she processed it, not the bell, but the quality of the silence that preceded what came through the doors. A change in the room's atmosphere. Something about the way the sound on the floor redistributed itself, like air moving around a new object placed in a space. Sandra touched her elbow. Claire. The word was quiet. The tone underneath it was not. Claire set down the medication she was preparing, capped it carefully, and turned. 3 people had stepped off the elevator and were moving down the corridor with the unhurried, deliberate pace of people who had never needed to announce themselves because their presence announces itself. The first was a man she had never seen in person, silver-haired, navy dress uniform, 4 stars on his shoulder boards, the kind of posture that didn't perform authority but simply was it. The second was a younger officer, a full commander, carrying a briefcase, matching pace precisely. The third was older chief petty officer's anchors at his collar, a broad-shouldered man, built like someone who had done physical work for decades and carried the evidence of it in the way he moved. He was holding a sealed service folder against his side. They stopped at the nurse's station. The vice admiral looked at Sandra. His voice, when he spoke, was conversational, not loud. He didn't need loud. We're looking for a nurse, Claire Voss. The floor went quiet in the specific way. It went quiet when something happened that people understood was significant before they understood why. Sandra turned slowly and looked at Claire. And across the hall, Warren Aldine, Lieutenant Colonel, United States Army, went completely still because the 3 men who had just walked in wore the uniform of a different branch, and they had not asked for an administrator, had not asked for a doctor, had not asked for anyone in charge. They had asked for the nurse. Claire Voss set down the chart she was holding. She walked toward them. Her pace was even. Her expression was not surprise, it was something else. Something that sat closer to the look of a person who had known a moment was eventually coming and had spent years deciding, quietly and without telling anyone, exactly how they intended to stand when it finally did. She walked toward them with the same pace she used. For everything on this floor, not slow, not hurried, just deliberate in the way that people were deliberate when they had stopped needing to perform composure, because composure had long since become the default setting. The vice admiral waited. He didn't shift his weight, didn't look around the floor the way visitors did when they were taking inventory of a new environment. He just watched her come toward him with the patient attention of someone who had been briefed and knew exactly what he was looking at, even if nobody else in the room did yet. She stopped in front of him. Up close, he was older than she'd clocked from across the hall, late 60s, the lines in his face deep and specific, the kind of face that had spent years outdoors in conditions that were not pleasant. His eyes were gray and steady, and carried the particular quality of someone who had learned to read people quickly, because the cost of misreading them had once been very high. "Vice Admiral Gareth Strom," he said, not offering a hand yet. Just his name, plainly, the way people introduced themselves when they weren't trying to impress anyone. "This is Commander Elia Watt." The younger officer nodded once. "And Master Chief Petty Officer Dale Renner." The older man, Renner, looked at her with an expression she couldn't categorize immediately. It wasn't hostile, and it wasn't warm. It was the expression of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had arrived at the place where he could finally set it down and wasn't yet sure how that was going to feel. "I know who you are," Claire said. "We figured you might," Strom said. "We'd have come sooner, but you made that complicated." "I didn't want it. We know that too." He glanced briefly around the floor at the nurse's station where Sandra stood pretending to type, at Thomas Wren hovering near the corridor entrance with the posture of a man who had stopped understanding what was happening in his own building, at the security officers who had straightened almost imperceptibly when the uniforms came off the elevator. Then his gaze moved past her, down the hall. "Is that him?" She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She knew exactly where Warren Aldine was standing. "Yes," she said. "We're going to need a space," Strom said. "Somewhere with enough room. What's available?" "Conference room at the end of the hall. It holds 12. That'll do." She nodded and led them down the corridor, and the effect of 3 Navy officers moving through an emergency department in full-dress uniform was immediate, and strange conversations dropped, movement slowed. Heads turned with the reflexive attention that uniforms commanded in places where uniforms were not common. She heard someone behind her say something in a low voice, and heard the person next to them say nothing back, which sometimes meant more. Thomas Wren materialized at her elbow before she reached the conference room door. His voice was compressed to nearly nothing. "Claire." "What is happening?" "Give me 20 minutes, Tom," she said without slowing. "Then I'll explain everything. You'll explain it now." "Tom." She stopped and looked at him directly, and something in her face made him stop talking. Not a threat, she didn't do threats. Something quieter than that, and more final. 20 minutes, please." He stepped back. She opened the conference room door. The room had a long table, 10 chairs, a whiteboard along one wall that still had discharge protocol notes written on it in blue marker from the last staff meeting. The blinds on the interior window were half open, which meant the nurse's station had a partial sight line in. Claire left them where they were. She sat across from Vice Admiral Strom. Commander Watt took the chair to his right and opened the briefcase on the table without being asked. Master Chief Renner sat at the far end, the sealed folder in front of him, his large hands flat on the table on either side of it. He hadn't said anything yet. She had the sense he was conserving something. "I'm going to ask you something first," Strom said. "All right. The incident this morning, the assault." He said the word cleanly, without softening it or framing it as a question. "Before we walked in here, had you filed a formal report?" "I requested the camera footage be flagged. I documented my account in the patient's chart notes. Hospital security was notified and is on the floor. I haven't given a formal written statement yet, because I've been managing 2 acute patients." "So you handled it the right way." "I handled it the way the situation called for." Strom studied her for a moment. You made a phone call. I did. You called a contact. That contact escalated to us. I told the contact not to escalate. I know what you told him. Something moved briefly across Strom's face, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. You've been declining this for 3 years, Voss. We weren't going to wait for a fourth. Claire folded her hands on the table. Outside through the half-open blinds, she could see the nurse's station, could see Sandra moving with the careful efficiency of someone keeping a floor running, while also being deeply aware that something significant was happening 20 feet away. She could see, at the quarter's edge, the shape of Warren Aldine, still present, still watching, though from this distance she couldn't read his expression. What changed, she asked. He hit you, Renner said. It was the first thing he'd said since arriving, and it came out flat and certain, with no decoration around it. He was looking at her steadily from the far end of the table, and she met his gaze and held it. That's not a reason to... It's not the only reason, Strom said. But it moved the timeline. He nodded to Watt, who had been quietly organizing documents from the briefcase. Commander. Watt slid a set of papers across the table. Not the sealed folder, those were still in front of Renner, but printed documents, official letterhead, the specific formatting that Claire recognized from a different chapter of her life. The citation has been processed, Watt said. Her voice was precise and even. It was finalized 14 months ago. We've been waiting on your authorization to proceed with any public acknowledgement. I told the liaison I wasn't authorizing it. You told the liaison you needed more time, Watt said, not unkindly. 14 months is more time. Claire looked at the papers without touching them. This is not what I would have chosen. We know, Strom said. We're asking you to let us do this anyway. Not for us. There's someone who needs to be here for this, and it's not me or Commander Watt. He glanced at Renner. The Master Chief looked down at the sealed folder in front of him. His jaw moved once, tightening, and then releasing. Then he looked back up at her, and the expression on his face was the one she hadn't been able to categorize before she understood it now. It was grief that had converted itself over years into something functional, something that could be carried and used rather than just felt. My son's name was Joel, he said. The room was quiet. I know, Claire said. He told me, before Renner stopped. Started again, with the deliberate precision of someone who had rehearsed this, and was still finding it harder than the rehearsal. He told me what happened, what you did. He wrote it in a letter, because he said he didn't think he could get through it out loud. His hands on the table, pressed flat. I've had that letter for 6 years. Claire said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make it smaller. I looked for you, Renner said, after. When I found out you'd left the service. I looked for where you'd gone, and I found you here. And I didn't come because you'd made it clear, through channels, that you didn't want to be found. A pause. I respected that. For 6 years I respected it. He looked at the folder. I can't respect it anymore. The silence in the conference room had a different texture now than the silence on the ER floor. That was the silence of people trying to determine what they were witnessing. This was the silence of people who already knew. All right, Claire said. Her voice was even, not cold even, which was different. What do you need from me? Strom leaned forward slightly. We'd like to do this here, today, on this floor, in front of the staff who work with you. We're aware that's not your preference. It's not. But we think the context matters, particularly given what happened this morning. His gray eyes were direct and not unkind. The man who struck you is still in this building. His rank is lieutenant colonel. The people who witnessed what he did to you are the same people who have never known what you did before you got here. We'd like to change that today, in the same room. Claire was quiet for a moment. Through the window blinds, she could see Sandra had stopped pretending to work. She was just standing at the station, looking at the conference room. And next to her, she could see that 2 of the other ER nurses, Patrick Greer and Amara Nkosi, had drifted close without appearing to do so intentionally. He's going to think this is about him, she said. For about 60 seconds, Strom said. And then he's going to understand that it isn't. She looked at the sealed folder in front of Renner, at the citation papers Watt had arranged on the table, at the 3 men across from her who had come to a hospital in Calverton, Ohio, in full dress uniform, in the middle of a Tuesday morning, because they had decided that whatever she wanted, some things needed to be said out loud. "Give me 10 minutes, she said. "I have a patient in Bay 5 who needs to be checked." Strom nodded. "We'll be here." She stood, pushed in her chair, and walked out of the conference room with the same stride she'd come in with, through the nurses' station, past Sandra, who opened her mouth and then closed it again, past Patrick, who was smart enough to say nothing. She went to Bay 5, where Russell Aldine was awake and had the television on low, some midday program he wasn't watching. His oxygen saturation read 93%. Better than an hour ago. He looked at her when she came through the curtain. His eyes went to her left cheek. She'd felt the bruising setting in over the last hour, knew it was visible now, and then back to her face. "I'm sorry," he said, "about Warren. You don't need to apologize for him," she said. She was already checking his IV line, his O2 sensor, the readout on the monitor. Everything where it should be. "How's your breathing feel?" "Better. Still tight when I take a deep one. That's expected. The repeat imaging is scheduled for 10:45. We're a little behind, but it'll happen." She made a note in the chart. "Is there anything you need right now? Pain level? 3? Maybe. Nothing bad." He watched her work. "There are Navy guys on the floor." "Yes." Warren looked like he'd seen a ghost. She capped her pen. "Your brother is going to have a difficult afternoon," she said. "That's not going to affect your care. You have my word on that." Russell studied her for a moment with the quiet, specific attention of someone who was not as unobservant as his mild manner suggested. "Who are you, exactly?" he asked. Not challenging, genuinely curious, in the way of someone piecing together a picture from fragments. "Right now I'm your nurse," she said. "That's the part that matters to you." She left the bay. On her way back through the floor, she nearly walked into Warren Aldine, who had positioned himself in the corridor between the nurses' station and the conference room with the particular placement of a man who wanted to make clear he was not going to be ignored. He was still in uniform. His face had reorganized itself into an expression of controlled authority, but the control was working harder than it usually did. She could see it in the tension around his eyes, in the slightly too rigid set of his shoulders. "I want to know who those men are," he said. "They're here to see me," she said. "On what basis?" She stopped and looked at him. 3 feet between them. He was taller than her by 5 or 6 inches, and was using it the way tall men sometimes did, letting the height be part of the argument. "That's not information I'm going to share with you," she said. "I have a right to know what's happening in this building." "You don't, actually. Not in this case." She kept her voice flat and informational, the same voice she used to explain medication interactions to patients. "What you have a right to do is speak with hospital administration about the formal complaint that's been filed against you this morning. Thomas Wren can help you with that process." Something moved through his face. Not the anger that was still there, underneath, but something new. Something that was closer to the early stages of a realization he was trying not to complete. "You called them?" he said. "No. Lieutenant Colonel," she said, his rank quietly, not odd as deference, but as information. "I'd encourage you to go find Thomas Wren." She walked past him. Behind her, she heard him say something else, but the words didn't reach her because she had already decided not to carry them, and that was a skill she'd developed in a different life, in a different kind of noise, and it still worked fine. Sandra was waiting at the nurse's station, with the expression of someone who had been professional for as long as she physically could and was approaching a limit. "Claire," she said quietly, "the camera footage. Admin has it. Wren is on the phone with the hospital's legal office right now." "Good. Aldine's been talking to anyone who'll stand still. He's saying you became verbally aggressive with him in Bay 5. That he reacted. The camera will address that. I know. Sandra stopped. Patrick saw it happen. From the station. He's already given a statement to security. Tell Patrick thank you. Amara saw it too. She's writing hers up now. Sandra paused. Half the floor saw it, Claire. Then the documentation will be thorough. She picked up a chart. What do we have pending? You're not going to... Sandra gestured vaguely at the conference room. You're not going to tell me what's in there? In about 10 minutes, it'll be easier to show you than to tell you. She looked at Sandra directly. Can you pull everyone available? Staff who are free, who can step away for a few minutes. The hallway, not the conference room. 10 minutes. Sandra blinked. How many people? Whoever's there, Claire said. It's fine. She went back to the conference room. Strom and Watt and Renner were where she'd left them. Though someone had brought 3 cups of coffee from the nursing station, she didn't know who. Sandra, probably, and they sat cooling and untouched on the table because none of the 3 men had touched them. All right, she said, sitting back down. Tell me how you want to do this. Strom nodded. He didn't look relieved, exactly. He looked like a man who had been holding a door open for a long time and was grateful it was finally walking through. Commander Watt laid out the sequence. There would be a brief address to whatever staff were present. Strom would speak. Renner had indicated he wanted to speak, though when Watt said this, she saw him press his mouth together and look at the table, which meant he had indicated it and was now not entirely sure. The citation would be presented formally. It had to be. The paperwork required it, and then the secondary documentation would be entered into official record, which meant it would exist in places that could not be subsequently altered or redacted. The assault complaint, Watt said. Hospital administration's process and the formal military complaint are separate tracks. You understand that? Yes. The military complaint is already filed. It was filed 43 minutes ago when we received confirmation of what had occurred this morning. She said it without drama. That process runs independently of what happens here today. Claire absorbed this. Who filed it? Watt looked at her steadily. We did. I didn't ask. You didn't need to, Strom said. One of our people was struck in a civilian medical facility by an active duty officer. That's not something we wait for a request on. She sat with that for a moment. Then she nodded once. The floor is going to be available in about 5 minutes, she said. I asked the charge nurse to pull whoever's free. Strom stood. Watt began gathering the documents with the efficient precision of someone who had done this before and understood the weight of paper. Renner stood last, picking up the sealed folder from the table, and when he straightened, he caught Claire's eye across the room. I just need you to know, he said, that I'm not doing this for the Navy. I'm not doing it for a record or a ceremony. He held the folder in both hands. I'm doing it because Joel asked me to. In the letter, he asked me to find you and tell you in front of other people so you couldn't minimize it. Because he said you would minimize it. His voice had roughed slightly at the edges. He knew you pretty well. Claire looked at him for a long moment. He was a good operator, she said, and a terrible patient. Something cracked open in Renner's face, then not grief, or not only grief, but something with relief in it, something that recognized the specific shape of a true thing when it was said plainly. Yeah, he said. He really was. They went out of the conference room together. The hallway had changed while she'd been inside. Sandra had done what Sandra always did when given a task that required both efficiency and discretion, which was executed completely and without apparent effort. There were 14 people in the corridor, nurses, techs, 2 residents, one of the cleaning staff who had stopped her cart and stood at the edge of the gathering, with the tentative posture of someone not sure she was meant to be included, but unwilling to leave. Thomas Wren was there, standing to one side, his phone in his hand, and his legal call apparently concluded. Dr. Navarro had come from wherever she'd been and stood near the nurse's station with her arms folded. And Warren Aldine was there. He had positioned himself near the far wall, which put him within clear sightline of the proceedings, and his face had changed again. The controlled authority was still attempting to hold. But something underneath it had begun to shift. Some foundational thing that was only now beginning to understand that the afternoon was no longer operating on the terms he'd arrived with. Vice Admiral Gareth Strom walked to the center of the corridor and stood in a way that didn't require anyone to be called to attention. The hallway went quiet on its own. He looked at the assembled staff for a moment. Then he spoke in a voice that was clear and unhurried and carried to every corner of the space without effort. I want to start by thanking you for the few minutes of your time. I understand this is a working floor, and I'll keep this brief. He didn't look at notes. He didn't need to. Some of you know the nurse Claire Voss as your colleague. Some of you have worked beside her for years. Very few of you, I'd expect, know anything about what she did before she came to work here. In her peripheral vision, Claire saw Aldine's posture shift. What I'm about to tell you, Strom continued, is a matter of official military record. It has been classified for operational reasons for several years and has recently been authorized for acknowledgement. He paused. Claire Voss served as a combat medical specialist across 3 overseas deployments, 2 of which involved direct support of special operations units in active conflict environments. Her service record includes actions that most people in this building will have no framework for, and that I will not summarize inadequately. What I will tell you is that on 2 separate occasions, under direct enemy fire, with communications compromised and medical supplies critically limited, she performed emergency surgical interventions that kept wounded personnel alive long enough to be evacuated. He let that land. The personnel she kept alive included a special operations team leader who is currently serving, and a younger operator who did not survive his second deployment, but who survived the first because of what Claire Voss did in a ditch in the dark with a field kit and 18 minutes of available time. The hallway was the quietest it had been all morning. Strom's turned slightly. Master Chief. Renner stepped forward. He was holding the sealed folder, and he'd opened it somewhere between the conference room and here, so the documents inside were visible, and he held it the way people held things that had weight that wasn't physical. He looked at the assembled staff. Then he looked at Claire, and when he spoke, his voice was controlled and rough at the same time. A man doing a hard thing correctly, because he had promised he would. My son's name was Joel Renner, he said. He was 26 years old on the night Claire Voss kept him alive. He stopped. Started again. He came home from that deployment, and he lived 4 more years, and he met his wife in those years, and they had 11 months together. Before his second tour, his jaw was working. I have 11 months of my son alive that I would not have had. My daughter-in-law has photographs she would not have. There is a grave with his name on it instead of a missing persons case that never closed. He looked directly at Claire. You did that. You did that alone, and you never asked for anything. And you left the service, and you came here, and you got up this morning, and you came to work early to cover for someone else's shift. His voice had roughed completely now, not breaking but fraying at the edges like rope under tension. I've been wanting to say this in front of other people for 6 years. Joel wanted me to say it in front of other people. He reached into the folder and removed the citation, a formal document with the official seal at the top, and he held it out. This doesn't cover it. Nothing covers it. But it's what we have. Claire walked forward and took it from him. She looked at it for a moment. Her face was doing the compression thing. Again, something internal being managed with great precision, the practiced stillness of someone who had learned to feel things completely without performing them. She looked up at Renner. He talked about you, she said, in the field, when we had time. He talked about you more than anything else. Renner nodded once. He couldn't say anything else right then, and he seemed to know it, and he didn't try. The hallway remained quiet. And then, from the far wall, there was a sound, a shift of weight, a subtle repositioning, and everyone in the corridor became aware, at the same moment, that Warren Aldine had been standing there through all of it, had heard every word of it, and was now standing in his army uniform in a Navy hospital corridor, holding the expression of a man who had walked into a building this morning as the most powerful person in it, and was only now, in this moment, beginning to understand the full dimensions of what he had done. Strom turned and looked at him, not with hostility, with the calm, specific attention of someone who had been waiting for this part. "You judged her," Strom said quietly, "before you knew her." It was not a question. It was not an accusation in the legal sense. It was a plain statement of observable fact, said in front of 14 witnesses, in the voice of a 4-star vice admiral, in a hallway where the camera at the far end board was recording, and had been recording since the morning began. Warren Aldine said nothing. His mouth opened slightly, closed. His hands, which had been so certain earlier flat on the desk, raised in that corridor, gesturing in that calculating way near the nurse's station, hung at his sides now without anything to do. And then Thomas Wren stepped forward from the edge of the gathering, and beside him was a woman Claire hadn't seen arrive, mid-40s suit, the specific neutral expression of someone from the hospital's legal office who had been on that phone call and had now come to the floor in person, and she was looking at Warren Aldine with the focused attention of someone who had a job to do and was ready to do it. Friend said, "Lieutenant Colonel Aldine, I need to ask you to come with me." And for the first time since he'd walked through the ER doors that morning, Warren Aldine did not argue, did not invoke his rank, did not demand to speak with someone in authority. He just looked at Claire one more time. She met his gaze, said nothing. There was nothing left that needed to be said, not by her, not in this hallway, not today. He turned and followed Thomas Wren down the corridor, the woman from legal stepping into pace beside them, and the sound of their footsteps faded toward the administrative wing. Claire stood in the middle of the hallway with the citation in her hand and 14 people around her who were very quiet and very still, and somewhere behind the nurse's station a monitor began to beep, a patient call light. Ordinary and immediate and necessary, and she looked up from the document in her hands and looked at Sandra. "What's Bay for?" she said. Sandra blinked, looked at her monitor. Mrs. Etheridge's husband. He just arrived. "I'll go," Patrick said immediately, already moving. Claire nodded. She folded the citation carefully and slid it into the pocket of her scrubs. She looked at Renner, who was standing a few feet away watching her, with an expression she now understood completely. "Will you be here for a while?" she asked him. "As long as you need," he said. "Then let me finish my rounds," she said, "and I'll find you." She turned and walked back toward the nurse's station, and as she did, Amar Nkosi stepped slightly out of the group, not blocking her path, just close enough to be deliberate, and said very quietly, "I didn't know." "Nobody did," Claire said. "That was the point." She kept walking. She was 3 steps from the nurse's station when her radio crackled the ER channel, not a patient call light, but the ambulance frequency, the one that meant something was incoming, and she needed to hear it before it arrived. The dispatcher's voice was clipped and professional and said the words that collapsed the next several hours into a single immediate point. Multi-vehicle accident on the Calverton interchange. 4 critical, ETA 11 minutes. Requesting trauma team on standby. Claire reached the station, hung the citation folder in her locker without ceremony, and picked up the radio. "This is Voss," she said. "Trauma Bay 1 and 2. Get Dr. Navarro. Tell Supply I need 2 crash carts staged at the ambulance entrance by the time the first rig pulls in." She was already moving toward the trauma corridor as she spoke, rolling her sleeves to the elbow. And somebody called the blood bank. Behind her, the floor came back to life, the specific, organized, purposeful noise of people who knew exactly what they were doing, moving fast in the same direction. She did not look back. The first ambulance hit the bay doors at 11 minutes and 40 seconds, which was 30 seconds. Longer than dispatch had estimated, which meant traffic on the Calverton Interchange was worse than the initial report, and the second and third rigs I'd be delayed behind it. Claire clocked all of this without breaking stride. Trauma Bay 1 was staged and ready crash cart to the left. Second IV pole in position. The respiratory tech already at the head of the bay with the airway kit open and organized in the sequence she would need it. She had run this bay enough times that the layout existed in her body rather than her head, and her hands went to the right places before her eyes confirmed them. Dr. Navarro came through the corridor door at a controlled run, her stethoscope already around her neck, snapping on gloves. What do we have? Multi-vehicle, interchange. Dispatch said 4 critical. First one's incoming now. Claire moved to the bay entrance. Blood bank confirmed 2 units O-negative staged. Ortho is paged. I requested neuro on standby but haven't confirmed. Get confirmation. Amara's on it. The ambulance bay doors opened, and the first gurney came through fast. The paramedic at the head rattling vitals in the compressed shorthand of someone who had been managing a dying person for 11 minutes and needed to transfer that information in under 26 seconds. Male, approximately 40, unrestrained driver, T-bone impact on the driver's side. BP's 68/40, heart rate 140, GCS 7 on scene, dropped to 5 in transit. Suspected internal, possible splenic. 2 large bore IVs, 1 liter LR running wide open. Claire was already moving alongside the gurney, her hand on the patient's wrist, feeling the pulse rapid, the thready, the specific character of a cardiovascular system trying to compensate for volume it no longer had. She looked at the man's face, mid-40s, gray at the temples, the slack expression of severe shock. His left side was wrong in a way that didn't require imaging to suspect the abdomen distended subtly, but definitely the skin around it starting to model. Bay 1, she said to the paramedics, and they moved. What followed was 47 minutes of the kind of work that had no aesthetics to it. It was loud, and it smelled like blood, and it required 7 people to be in precise communication, while each of them was doing something different with their hands. The second gurney came in 6 minutes after the first, a woman, early 30s, head trauma, pupils unequal. The third came 11 minutes after that, a teenager, both femurs fractured, in the specific distress of someone whose pain was so extreme it had burned through the morphine they'd given in the field. The fourth critical arrived while Claire was managing a tension pneumothorax on the first patient, and she had to talk Sandra through a needle decompression in the adjacent bay because Navarro was wrist deep in the abdominal emergency, and the surgical resident on backup had frozen for 3 seconds too long at the site of the presentation. Sandra, Claire said, not loud, not sharp, just clear. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. You've done this before. It's been a while. It's not different than it was. Angle, pressure, listen for the release. Go, Sandra went. The release came. The patient's oxygen saturation climbed from 71 to 88 in 90 seconds, and Sandra let out a breath that was short and controlled and then went back to work. The surgical team arrived for the first patient at the 30-minute mark and took him upstairs. Them ups. Navarro stayed on the second. The third patient, the teenager, was stabilized enough for ortho to transport. The fourth was the one that almost got away from them. He was a man in his late 50s, construction worker's hands, no ID recovered from the scene, arrived with an apparently stable GCS of 13 that dropped to 8 between the paramedic handoff and the bay assessment, a change that happened fast enough that Claire caught it before the monitor did, reading it in the shift of his eyes, the way his responses slowed and thickened. Navarro, she called. Navarro was across the corridor. I'm mid-procedure. This one's herniating. I need you in 30 seconds. Or I need you to tell me what you want me to do. A pause of 2 seconds. Do you have a pupil? Right pupil blown. Left is sluggish. Manidal. Get neurosurge down here now. Elevate the head of the bed 30 degrees. Keep him on that blood pressure. Already doing it. I'll be there in 4 minutes. I'll keep him here in 4 minutes, Claire said, and turned back to the bay. She kept him there in 4 minutes. Neurosurgery arrived at the 3-minute, 40-second mark, which was fast for neurosurgery, and took over the management with the controlled intensity of specialists who understood what a blown pupil meant and how much time they didn't have. Claire gave the handoff and stepped back, and for the first time in 47 minutes, she stopped moving. She was standing at the edge of the corridor outside Trauma Bay 2. Her gloves were bloody. There was something on her left forearm, a spray. She hadn't noticed it happen. And her scrub top had a dark stain along the right hem, where she'd pressed against the gurney rail in Bay 1. The bruise on her cheek had tightened in the heat of the last hour, a deep specific ache that she'd been ignoring and was now aware of, again. Patrick appeared beside her with a bottle of water. He didn't say anything. He just held it out. She took it, drank half of it, handed it back. Bay 5, she said. Russell Aldine sat, is holding at 94. Repeat imaging went through 20 minutes ago while you were in trauma. Navarro's team flagged the results. She hasn't had time to review them. Where are the images? At her station. I'll pull them. She was already moving. What else? Vice Admiral Strom is in the family waiting room with his people. He said no rush, they'll wait. A pause. Master Chief Renner is with him. Tell them I'll be 20 minutes. Also, Patrick said, and something in his voice made her slow, Aldine is still in the building. She stopped. Tom said he was going to admin. He went. And then, about 30 minutes ago, he came back to the floor. He's in the family corridor near Bay 5. Patrick's voice was carefully neutral in the way it got. He was managing his own reaction to something. He was told he could wait there for a family update on Russell's condition, which is technically within his rights as next of kin, yes. She turned this over. Where's security? Marcus is in the corridor. He's watching. All right. She changed her gloves. She pulled up the imaging results at Navarro's station and read them with the focus of someone who had been reading chest films in low-light conditions in places where the nearest radiologist was 300 miles away. What she saw in Russell Aldine's repeat imaging was not good news, and it was not immediately dangerous news, but it was the specific category of news that required a clear and honest conversation with a patient and his family, and it needed to happen before the end of the shift. She flagged the images for Navarro with a note, then walked to Bay 5. Russell was awake. He'd had that television off for a while. She could tell the screen was dark, and he was looking at the ceiling with the particular stillness of someone who had been doing a lot of thinking in a quiet room. He turned when she came through the curtain. His eyes went, again, to her cheek. Busy morning, she said. I heard the ambulances. He watched her move to his monitor, check his readings. Is everyone okay? They're getting care? She said, which was the truest answer she could give. She looked at his numbers. Sat still holding at 94. Respiratory rate down from this morning, which was good. Heart rate stable. I need to talk to you about your imaging results, she said. Dr. Navarro is going to come speak with you as soon as she's free. She's managing a trauma case right now. But I want you to have some time to process the information before she gets here, because it's going to require some decisions. Russell looked at her. He was the kind of man who had learned, probably through some experience she didn't know, to go quiet when the important things were being said. Okay, he said. She told him what she'd seen in the images. She used plain language, and she didn't soften it past accuracy, and she didn't expand it past what was necessary. A mass in the left lower lobe. Not the ambiguity from the morning film. This was a defined finding, which in some ways was worse news, and in some ways was better because ambiguity had its own terror, and a defined finding had a defined path forward. Russell was quiet for a long moment after she finished. How long, he said. How long it's been there, or how long you have to make decisions. Both, I guess. I can't tell you how long it's been there. That's a conversation for pulmonology and oncology. As for decisions, Dr. Navarro will have more for you on that today. Probably this afternoon. She looked at him directly. You're not alone in this, Russell. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Warren's going to... He stopped. Is Warren still here? He's in the family corridor. Something moved across Russell's face. Complicated geography, the specific terrain of a person whose relationship with a sibling had always been layered and difficult, and who was now processing that the sibling had made a catastrophic decision this morning in this building, and was also the person who would need to be told about a mass in his lung. You don't have to see him today, Claire said. That's entirely your choice. He's still my brother, Russell said quietly. Even when he's an idiot. She left him with that and walked out of the bay and into the family corridor. Warren Aldine was standing at the window at the far end of the corridor that looked out on the hospital parking structure. He turned when he heard her footsteps. The controlled authority was gone completely now. What was left was something rawer and less organized, a man without his armor, which sometimes made men like him more dangerous and sometimes made them more human, and she was not yet sure which version she was walking toward. Marcus Tully, the security officer, was at the corridor entrance, visible and present. Your brother is stable, she said, stopping 6 feet from Aldine. Professional distance. His imaging results show a finding that requires follow-up. Dr. Navarro will speak with you and Russell together this afternoon, if Russell chooses to have you present. Aldine absorbed this. His jaw tightened. What kind of finding? That's Dr. Navarro's conversation to have. I have a right. To information that Russell authorizes you to have. Yes. She kept her voice level. He's awake and aware and capable of making that decision. When he makes it, you'll be informed. Aldine looked at her for a long moment. He looked different now than he had in Bay 5 this morning. The posture was the same, the frame was the same, but something load-bearing inside it had shifted and hadn't found its new configuration yet. The people who came, he said. The Navy. Yes. I didn't know, he said. She waited to see where this was going. I didn't know who you were, he said. I'm not saying that as an excuse. I'm saying he stopped. His hands came up slightly and then dropped. I behaved in a way that I... Another stop. The sentence wasn't finding its end, and she didn't help it along. I've never struck a civilian, he said, finally, and the way he said it told her it was true, and also that it didn't change anything about what had happened, and she thought from his expression that on some level he understood both of those things. It wouldn't have been acceptable if I'd been anyone else. Either, she said. He looked at her. No, he said. No, it wouldn't have. She held his gaze for exactly a moment longer than was comfortable, and then she said, I'll let you know when, Doctor. Navarro is available, and she turned and walked back toward the main floor. Behind her she heard nothing. No argument. No demand. No invocation of rank. She got back to the nurse's station and found Sandra at the desk with the expression of someone who had been running a floor through a multi-casualty event and was now discovering she was also managing an institutional crisis and was doing both with the kind of competence that didn't ask for acknowledgement. Navarro's out of procedure, Sandra said. She's reviewing the Aldine imaging now. Good. Tell her Russell's been informed. He knows the broad shape of it. Also, Sandra said lower, there's something you need to know. She turned her monitor slightly. Wren's office sent this to the floor about 10 minutes ago. It was a brief internal memo. Claire read it in 15 seconds. The hospital's legal office had completed a preliminary review of the camera footage from Bay 5 and the corridor outside it. The memo confirmed that the footage had been secured and was being preserved as evidence. It noted that a formal complaint had been filed with hospital administration and that the matter had been referred to the hospital's patient safety and employee patient safety and employee protection office. There was a second paragraph noting that the military complaint filed through separate channels had been acknowledged by the hospital's legal team and that coordination between the two processes was being managed. At the bottom, in the clipped prose of legal correspondence, was a single additional line that indicated Warren Aldine had been formally restricted from entering clinical areas of the hospital, pending the completion of the investigation. She handed the tablet back to Sandra. "He's in the family corridor," she said. "I know. Marcus is there. The family corridor is technically not a clinical area." Sandra paused. "Legal knows. They're working out the language." Claire nodded. Then she went to find Strom. The family waiting room at the end of the west corridor was a room that nobody liked being in, including the people who worked in the building. It had the specific institutional sadness of a space designed for waiting, with chairs that had been chosen for durability rather than comfort, and a window that looked out on a concrete facade rather than anything that would help. Strom was in one of the chairs by the window. Watt was across from him, working on something in the briefcase. Renner was standing by the door, which told her something about how he processed confinement. She sat down across from Strom. "Your trauma cases," he said. "Everyone stable? 2 upstairs, 1 in neuro, 1 still in the bay." She folded her hands. "You waited. We said we would." She looked at him. "What happens now?" Procedurally. "The citation is entered into official record today. That's done regardless of anything else." He leaned forward slightly. "The assault complaint, the military one, runs through the Inspector General's office. They'll request the camera footage from the hospital. They'll conduct interviews. That process takes weeks, sometimes longer." And his career. Strom looked at her with the measured expression of someone who was not going to speculate about outcomes while being fairly certain about them. "A lieutenant colonel with a documented assault on a civilian in a medical facility, with camera footage, with a Navy vice admiral as a witness to the secondary conduct, the public humiliation of a decorated veteran, and with an IG complaint filed." He paused. "I would not want to be his promotion board. He said he didn't know who I was." "That's the point," Strom said. "It wasn't acceptable because of who you are. It was never going to be acceptable. The rank he was swinging around as a shield is the same institution whose uniform he disgraced. That's going to be part of the record." Renner spoke from the door. "There's something else." She turned to look at him. He had the sealed folder again, the one from which he'd taken the citation, in the hallway. There was something still inside it. She could see the edge of a second document. "This was Joel's," he said. He came across the room and sat down, which was the first time she'd seen him sit since they'd arrived, and it changed his size somehow, made him look less like the frame he carried and more like the person inside it. He removed the second document from the folder and held it for a moment before handing it across. It was not an official document. It was a letter handwritten, 3 pages, the handwriting of someone who had been trained to write neatly and had never quite managed it, so each line sloped slightly, regardless of the ruled paper beneath. The date in the upper right corner was 6 years ago, 2 months after the deployment. She looked at the top of the first page and then looked up at Renner. "He asked me to give it to you in person," Renner said. "Not mail it. Not have someone pass it along. In person." His voice was steady now, in a way it hadn't been in the corridor. He'd found the bottom of the thing and was standing on it. "I've been carrying it for 6 years. She took the letter. She didn't read it there. She folded it carefully and held it in both hands and did the internal work of keeping her face at neutral while something behind her sternum did something she didn't have a clinical name for and didn't want one. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Renner said. "He wrote it. I just carried it." "You came here," she said. "That's not nothing." He looked at his hands. "No," he said after a moment. "I guess it isn't." She stood. Strom stood. Watt closed the briefcase with a quiet click. "We'll need a contact for the IG process," Watt said. "If they want a statement from you regarding the conduct in the hallway, this morning the public acknowledgement the presence of Lieutenant Colonel Aldine as a witness to the proceedings." "Whatever they need," Claire said. "Sandra can give you my contact information." She was at the door of the waiting room when Strom said, "Voss." She turned. He picked the right nurse. Strom said. Not the right medic, not the right soldier, the right nurse. He'd chosen the word deliberately. She could see it, hid in the care with which he said it, and she understood what he was doing. She looked at him, nodded once, went back to the floor. The afternoon moved the way afternoons moved after a mass casualty event, fast in places and oddly still in others, the adrenaline metabolized, and the work continuing in its altered, post-crisis state. She did her rounds. She checked on the patients from the morning. She read Joel Renner's letter in the supply corridor, standing under the security camera with nobody around, reading it twice, and then folding it along its original creases and putting it in the same pocket as the citation. She was coming back through the main corridor when she heard it. Not an argument, not a confrontation. Something quieter and more structural, a change in the quality of the noise near the administrative wing, 3 doors down from the nursing station, where Thomas Wren's office occupied the corner. She didn't slow. She kept her pace, but her attention shifted. And then Warren Aldine appeared from the administrative corridor, walking fast, not in the controlled way he'd walked when he arrived, but in the fractured urgent way of someone who had just received information that had changed the operational situation entirely and hadn't yet figured out how to respond to it. He saw her. He stopped. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He was holding a piece of paper, official letterhead. She could see the hospital's seal at the top from 8 feet away. His face had the specific expression of a man who had been in the administrative who had been in manned administrative wing, managing a process he thought he understood, and had just discovered had already produced as a result he hadn't anticipated. There's a second complaint, he said. Yes, she said. From the Navy. Filed this morning. His voice was not loud. Before they even came to this floor. Yes. Before anyone knew he stopped. They filed it before they saw the footage. They filed it when they received confirmation of what occurred, she said. They didn't need the footage. There were witnesses. He stared at her. This is going to go to the IG. It already has, she said. Something happened in his face, then a sequence of things, moving through quickly the way they did when a person's understanding of a situation restructured itself in real time. The arrogance had been gone since the hallway. What was replacing it was something more complicated and considerably more permanent looking. Is there anything I can do? He said. The word anything came out rough. Not a threat. The opposite, a man trying to locate a door in a room that was closing. She looked at him for a long moment. Take care of your brother, she said. She walked past him. She was nearly at the nurse's station when Sandra caught her eye and held up 2 fingers, 2 new arrivals in the waiting queue, non-critical but needing assessment. Claire nodded. She was reaching for the first chart when her radio crackled again. This time not the ambulance channel, but the internal security frequency, the one that was used for building-level alerts and for communications between security personnel and clinical staff. The voice that came through was Marcus Tully, calm and professional, and carrying beneath it a note she recognized. This is Tully Security. Can I get Nurse Voss on channel? She picked up the radio. This is Voss. I need you at the north stairwell, Marcus said. Now please, what's in the north stairwell? A pause. 2 seconds, which was long for Marcus, who was not a man who used pauses. Master Chief Renner, he said. He was heading to the parking structure, and he stopped in the stairwell about 10 minutes ago, and he hasn't moved. I checked on him, and he's... Another pause. He's okay. He's not in distress. But I think he needs... Marcus seemed to run out of professional language. I think he just needs a minute, and he doesn't want to be alone. Claire set down the chart. She looked at Sandra. I'll be back in 5 minutes, she said. She went to the north stairwell. The door opened onto the concrete landing between the first and second floors, and the light in there was the flat institutional kind that stairwells always had. And Dale Renner was sitting on the second step from the bottom, with his back against the wall and the empty folder in his hands, a folder that had carried a citation and a letter for 6 years and was now empty, and his face had the specific expression of a man who had finished a very long task and didn't yet know what to do with his hands. He looked up when she came through the door. She sat down on the step beside him. Not across from him, beside him. They sat there in the flat light of the stairwell, and neither of them said anything for a while. He was 26, Renner said eventually. I know. He would have been 32 now. A pause. His wife got remarried last year. Good guy, I think. She deserves to be happy. His voice was not bitter. It was the voice of a man who had done the work of arriving somewhere reasonable about an unreasonable thing. I keep thinking about what he would have said about today, about all of this. He turned the empty folder over in his hands. He would have thought it was funny, you being a nurse. He would have made some joke about bedside manner. She almost smiled. He had opinions about my bedside manner in the field. Yeah? Something shifted in Renner's face. What did he say? He said I was the least comforting medical professional he had ever met, but that he would rather have me in a ditch than anyone else he could name. Renner made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else. It lasted only a second. That's him, he said. That's exactly him. They sat with that for a moment. The letter, Renner said. I read it. Okay. He nodded slowly. Okay. She thought about the letter. About what Joel had written in the sloping handwriting on the ruled paper, and about the specific thing at the end of the third page that she was not going to repeat out loud because it belonged to the stairwell and the empty folder and the flat light, and not to any other room. He said, you never left him, Renner said, in the letter. He said you stayed with him the whole time, when the others were moving up. That you didn't have to stay. I know, she said. Why did you? She was quiet for a moment. Because he was scared, she said. He was trying not to show it, but he was scared, and the work wasn't done yet, and leaving a person alone when they're scared, and the work isn't done, felt wrong. Renner looked at the empty folder. It was enemy fire. Yes, you stayed in enemy fire because he was scared. And because the work wasn't done, she said again. Which was true. Both things were true at the same time, and she'd never seen any contradiction between them. Renner sat with that. Outside, muffled by the stairwell door, she could hear the ambient noise of the floor, the monitors, the movement, the ordinary machinery of a working hospital, keeping people alive. In here it was just the flat light and the concrete, and the sound of a man who had carried something for 6 years and had now set it down. I should let you get back, he said. In a minute, she said. They sat there for another 90 seconds, which was not a long time, and was exactly the right amount of time. And then she stood, and he straightened his uniform with the automatic precision of muscle memory, and she opened the stairwell door. The noise of the floor came back in. She stepped through the door first. Renner followed, and they walked back onto the floor, and she turned toward the nurse's station, and he turned toward the elevators. And that was how it was the ordinary geography of people returning to where they needed to be. She was 3 steps from the nurse's station when Sandra looked up from the monitor with expression that Claire had never seen on Sandra's face in 4 years of working beside her. Not panic. Sandra didn't panic. Not confusion. Something with urgency in it, and something else underneath that she couldn't immediately categorize. Bay 5, Sandra said. Now Russell. He's stable. It's not Russell. Sandra's voice had dropped to nearly nothing. Someone got into the bay. Claire was already moving. Who? She said. Warren Aldine, Sandra said. He got past Marcus while Marcus was in the stairwell. He's in there with Russell, and the door's closed, and I can see them on the camera feed, and Warren has the imaging report in his hand, and Russell is... She stopped. Claire, Russell is crying. Claire pushed through the Bay 5 curtain. The scene inside was not what she had expected, and the thing she had not expected stopped her for exactly 1 second in the doorway before she understood what she was seeing. Warren Aldine was not standing over his brother. He was sitting in the chair beside the bed, the same chair Claire used for charting, and he had Russell's imaging report in his hand, but he wasn't holding it like ammunition. He was holding it like something fragile, and his face had the raw, undefended expression of a man who had just been told something that had stripped every other concern in the world down to a single point. Russell was looking at his brother. His eyes were wet. He wasn't trying to hide it. Warren looked up when Claire came through the curtain. His face did something complicated. Then he said, quietly, "He told me." She looked at Russell. Russell nodded slightly. "You should have been in the family corridor," she said to Warren. Her voice was even. "You're restricted from clinical areas." "I know," he said. He didn't move. "I know. I'll go." But he didn't go immediately. He looked at his brother, and his hand came up, and he put it on Russell's arm, and Russell put his hand over his brother's hand. And for a moment, the room held something that had nothing to do with cameras or complaints or lieutenant colonels or Navy vice admirals. Then Warren stood. He turned to Claire. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, he said, "He needs the best care this floor has." "He's getting it," she said. "I know he is," Warren said. "That's—" He stopped. Then he said something she didn't expect, and it came out badly formed and imprecise, in the way that things did when they were true and hadn't been rehearsed. "I know he is," he said again, differently. "I could see it. From this morning, I could see it, and his jaw worked. I was wrong. About everything this morning. Every part of it." She looked at him. "There is a formal process," she said. "What happens in that process is not mine to determine." "I know, but your brother needs you to walk out of this bay right now and wait in the family corridor and let Dr. Navarro do her work." He nodded. He squeezed Russell's arm once, and Russell said nothing, and Warren Aldine walked past Claire and through the curtain, and she heard his footsteps going away down the corridor, slow and without their morning certainty. She turned to Russell. "I'm sorry," he said. "He came in before I could." "It's all right," she said. She checked his monitor. His SAT had held. His rate was elevated understandably, but nothing that required intervention. "How are you feeling?" "Like I just got very bad news," he said. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, and then watched my brother be a human being for the first time in maybe 20 years. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "It's been a weird afternoon." She made a note in his chart. She was stepping out of the bay when her radio crackled again, not Marcus this time. Not the ambulance frequency, but the administrative channel, the one that carried communications from Wren's office to the floor. Thomas Wren's voice was careful and precise, and carried something underneath it that made her stop in the corridor and hold the radio. "Claire," he said, "I need you in my office. When you have a moment." A pause. "Actually not when you have a moment. Now, please." She keyed the radio. "What is it, Tom?" Another pause, slightly longer than the first. "I've just had a call from the IG's regional office," he said. "They've expedited the preliminary review based on the Navy's complaint and the camera footage we transmitted." His voice had the quality of someone reading carefully from notes. "They've made a preliminary finding." She waited. "They're characterizing the conduct as conduct unbecoming," Wren said. "And they've contacted the Army to initiate a review of Lieutenant Colonel Aldine's command authority." He paused. "Claire, they want a formal statement from you today. Not tomorrow. Today." Another pause, and in it she heard something that was not quite Wren's usual register, something with weight in it that he was managing imperfectly. "And there's something else in the call that I need to tell you in person." "Ow." She held the radio. "I'll be there in 2 minutes," she said. She walked to Wren's office with the same stride she used for everything on this floor, and the 2 minutes she'd given herself were exactly 2 minutes, because she stopped at the nurses' station long enough to tell Sandra where she was going and to ask Patrick to cover Bay 5, and the 2 pending assessments in the queue, and Patrick said yes before she finished asking, which was one of the things she valued about Patrick. Wren's office was a corner room off the administrative corridor, separated from the clinical floor by 2 sets of swinging doors, and a change in the quality of the light fluorescent tubes here instead of the warmer overheads they'd put in the ER bays 3 years ago, when someone from patient Experience had read a study about lighting and anxiety. The carpet was institutional gray. There was a whiteboard on one wall with a weekly schedule grid that hadn't been updated since Thursday. Wren's desk had the organized disorder of a man who processed paper by moving it from one location to another without ever reducing its total volume. He was standing when she came in, not sitting behind the desk, standing to one side of it, which was unusual for Wren, who habitually put furniture between himself and difficult conversations. Beside him, in the chair nearest the window, was a woman Claire hadn't seen before, mid-50s, a dark blazer over a collared shirt, the posture of someone who sat in rooms like this regularly and had long since stopped being affected by the furniture. Claire. Wren gestured to the other chair. This is Catherine Sorrell. She's the Regional Patient Safety Director. She drove in from Columbus when the IG call came through. Claire sat. She looked at Sorrell, who looked back with the measured attention of a professional assessor, not hostile, not warm, the specific neutral of someone whose job required her to form conclusions and who had learned to delay expression of those conclusions until she had enough data. Ms. Voss, Sorrell said, I'll be direct with you because I think you'd prefer that. I would, Claire said. The IG's office has expedited their preliminary review because the Navy's complaint was filed with specific supporting documentation, time-stamped witness statements from Vice Admirals Strom and Commander Watt, both of whom were present on the floor during portions of this morning's events. That documentation, combined with the camera footage your administration transmitted, was sufficient for IG to make a preliminary characterization within the same business day. She had a folder on her knee. She hadn't opened it yet. That characterization, as your administrator told you, is conduct unbecoming. But when Tom said there was something else he needed to tell you in person, this is what he meant. She opened the folder. During the IG's preliminary review, they ran a standard background check on Lieutenant Colonel Aldine, standards procedure when an officer is the subject of a complaint. She looked at the document. They found a prior complaint, 14 months ago, filed by a civilian employee at Fort Belman, a procurement officer named Diane Castillo. The room was quiet. What kind of complaint? Claire said. Intimidation. Coercion. Ms. Castillo alleged that Aldine pressured her to alter documentation in a procurement review specifically to underreport discrepancies in a contractor's billing submissions. When she refused, she alleged that Aldine used his rank and his access to her chain of command to have her reassigned. Sorrell's voice was precise, and without drama, the voice of someone describing facts rather than performing them. The complaint was filed. It was reviewed internally. It was closed without finding. Why? Sorrell looked at her. Because the reviewing officer was a colonel who had worked directly under Aldine for 3 years, and because Ms. Castillo had no documentation beyond her own account, and because she withdrew the complaint 4 weeks after filing it. A pause. She withdrew it after her reassignment was finalized, and she was moved to a posting 3 states away. Claire sat with this for a moment. The IG found this in 14 months of records, she said. They found it today. They found it within 4 hours of receiving the Navy's complaint. Because the Navy's complaint was specific and documented and came from a 4-star flag officer. Sorrell closed the folder. What that means practically is that Castillo's original complaint is now being reopened as part of the same IG investigation. Aldine is no longer the subject of a single incident. He's the subject of a pattern inquiry. Wren had moved to his desk. He sat down behind it now in his chair. He looked like a man who had received more information in one afternoon than he typically processed in a month. What does that mean for us? He asked Sorrell. For the hospital, it means your documentation needs to be complete and available. Everything from this morning, camera footage, written statements, chart notes, security logs. She looked at Claire. For you, it means your formal statement today carries more weight than a single incident account. You're not just documenting an assault. You're documenting a behavioral pattern in a formal record that now has a prior data point attached to it. Claire looked at the folder. Has anyone contacted Castillo? The IG's office will, Sorrell said. That's not something I have visibility into. She withdrew her complaint because she was isolated and transferred and had no documentation. If the IG contacts her now, she'll have the context of a pattern inquiry behind her, Sorrell said, and the Navy's complaint in front of her. That's a different room than the one she was sitting in 14 months ago. She held Claire's gaze. The statement you give today is part of what makes that room possible. Claire looked at the window. Outside, the parking structure. Gray concrete, afternoon light flat against it. She thought about the morning, the voice at the admissions desk, the walk to Bay 5, the specific sound of the impact, the 7 words she'd said, the phone call in the supply corridor. She thought about Diane Castillo, whom she'd never met, in a posting 3 states away, who had filed a complaint and had it closed and had never had a 4-star flag officer standing in her building. All right, she said. Where do you need me? Here is fine, Sorrell said. I can take your initial statement. The IG will follow up with their own process. But a documented account from this office today, time-stamped and signed, goes into the record immediately. Wren stood. I'll get you some privacy, Tom, Claire said. Whoever is taking the statement, I want Sandra Yee present, as a witness to the process. Wren looked at her. That's not standard. I know it's not. I'm asking for it. He looked at Sorrell. Sorrell nodded once. That's acceptable, she said. I'll get Sandra, Wren said, and left. He was back in 4 minutes. Sandra came in with the expression of someone who had been pulled from a busy floor and understood that what she was being pulled for was serious and was composing herself accordingly. She sat in the chair by the door. She didn't say anything. She folded her hands and was present. The statement took 40 minutes. Claire gave it the way she gave everything directly, in sequence, without embellishment and without minimization. She described the voice at the desk, the walk to the bay, the conversation, the phone she'd checked, the statement about rank, the 2 steps toward her, the strike, the sound, the words she'd said. She described the call in the supply corridor. She described the patient care she'd returned to immediately afterward. Because that was part of the record too, the fact that she had gone from being struck to managing a potential STEMI presentation without a gap. Because the work was what the work was. Sorrell asked questions at several points, not leading questions, clarifying ones. She asked about the specific words, the sequence of events, the position of other personnel. She asked about the camera angle in Bay 5, and whether Claire had been aware of it at the time. I knew the camera was there, Claire said. I know where all the cameras are on this floor, and you didn't position yourself or the conversation with that in mind. I positioned myself between the patient's bed and the door, which is where I stand when I'm talking to a patient's family member. That's standard. She held Sorrell's gaze. The camera angle was incidental. When the statement was complete, Claire signed it. Sorrell dated it, added her own notation, and closed the folder. Sandra stood. She looked at Claire with the expression of someone who had sat still for 40 minutes while a person she worked with described something that had happened in the building, where they both spent most of their waking hours, and who was managing what that meant with the imperfect tools available to her. Thank you, Sandra, Claire said. Don't, Sandra said quietly. Just don't thank me for that. Claire looked at her. Okay. They went back to the floor. The afternoon had shifted while she'd been in Wren's office. The light through the corridor, windows, had gone from midday from early flat to early afternoon angled, and the floor had found the specific rhythm it settled into after a mass casualty event, the rhythm of continued care and managed exhaustion. The trauma patients were upstairs. The morning's queue had been worked through. The bay monitors showed stable numbers across the board, which was not the same as everything being fine, but was the working definition of fine that people in emergency medicine operated on. She went back to her patients. She checked on the construction worker, from Bay 2, who had been moved to a holding bay pending admission, and who was now telling a long story about a previous nail gun incident to a resident, who looked like he was trying to decide if the story was medically relevant. She updated charts. She managed 2 new arrivals, a child with a high fever who turned out to have an ear infection, bad enough to have perforated the drum, and an elderly man who had fallen getting out of the shower and had a hairline fracture of the radial head that was going to hurt for 6 weeks but was not going to kill him. Ordinary work, the work that the morning had been built around before it became something else. At 3:47, Dr. Navarro found her at the nurse's station. "I talked to Russell," Navarro said. She had a coffee cup in her hand that was clearly not her first and probably not her third. And to the family. A pause. Warren Aldine was in the family corridor. Russell asked me to include him in the conversation. "All right. The imaging is concerning, but not conclusive. I've referred to pulmonology, and I've put in a preliminary oncology consult. He'll need a bronchoscopy. I'd like to do it this week if we can get him scheduled." She looked at Claire with the expression of a physician who understood that she was telling a nurse something the nurse had already read in the films and was confirming rather than informing. "You caught it. The first film was ambiguous. The first film was ambiguous because it was a borderline presentation. The repeat showed it because we repeated it because you pushed for it at 7 a.m. when he'd been stable for 2 hours, and it would have been easy to defer." Navarro's voice was even. "You caught it, Claire." Claire said nothing. "I told Warren Aldine the same thing," Navarro said, in the family corridor, in front of him. She sipped her coffee. He didn't say anything back, just nodded. "How is he?" Navarro considered this in the brief, assessing way physicians considered things that were outside their specialty. "He looks like a man who came into a building at 9 a.m. with everything and is leaving it with considerably less," she said. "And who is also sitting in a corridor, knowing that the nurse who caught his brother's lung mass is the same person he struck in that same building 6 hours ago." She paused. "I imagine that's a specific kind of uncomfortable. He's still here?" "He said he'd wait until Russell settled for the night. He said he could use the family corridor." Navarro looked at her. "That was my call to make, not yours. I know it might not be what you wanted." "It's fine," Claire said. And she meant it. Russell had asked for his brother. That was a patient's choice to make, not hers. Navarro nodded and moved on. At 4:15, Marcus Tully came to the nurse's station with the expression of a man delivering something he'd been asked to deliver and had feelings about. "Aldine asked me to give you this," he said. He held out a folded piece of paper, not official letterhead, just the plain note paper that sat in stacks in the family corridor waiting rooms. She took it. She opened it. The handwriting was controlled and slightly too precise, the writing of someone who had learned to write in an environment that graded penmanship. "Ms. Voss, I owe you more than this, and I understand that. The formal process will run whatever course it runs, and that is appropriate. I'm not writing to ask for anything. I'm writing because I was told this afternoon that my brother's tumor may not have been found for months if you hadn't pushed for the second imaging this morning. I don't know how to sit with that, alongside everything else that happened today. I don't expect you to make it easier." W. Aldine, she read it twice. Then she folded it and held it. She didn't know what she felt about it, exactly. Not forgiveness that was a process, not a moment. And this was one piece of paper on one afternoon, and the formal record was already in motion and would not be stopped by a note on family corridor note paper. Not contempt either. Contempt was easy, and she had never found easy to be the same as useful. What she felt when she located it precisely was the specific complicated texture of a situation that was not going to resolve into something clean, because the real ones never did, and she'd been around long enough to stop expecting them to. She put the note in her pocket. She went back to work. Vice Admiral Strom and Commander Watt left the building at 4:30 After Strom came briefly to the nurse's station to tell her the citation had been formally entered into the record and that the IG contact for the ongoing process would be in touch within the week. He shook her hand when he said it, which was not something he'd done when they'd arrived. The gesture was small and deliberate, and she received it the same way. Renner stayed. He didn't announce that he was staying. He was simply still there at 4:30 when Strom left, sitting in the family waiting room with a cup of coffee that someone had brought him and a phone he wasn't looking at. And when Claire passed the waiting room door at 4:42, he looked up and they exchanged the specific glance of two people who had sat together in a stairwell, didn't need language to account for it. She pointed at the coffee. Is that from the nursing station? The charge nurse brought it. Sandra makes terrible coffee. Yes, she does, he said, and held the cup up anyway, and she almost smiled and kept moving. At 5:10, with her shift technically ending at 5 and running long in the way shifts always did, she was finishing her final chart entries when Patrick appeared at the station. Warren Aldine is at the main desk, Patrick said. He's asking to speak with hospital administration. Not you. He specifically said not to involve you. He paused. Security is with him. He's not causing any problem. He just showed up at the desk and asked for Ren. Did he say why? He said he wanted to provide a voluntary statement. Patrick's voice was careful. To the hospital. For the record. She looked at Patrick. A voluntary statement. To the hospital's record. Unsolicited. On the same day, the IG had reopened Castillo's complaint and classified this as a pattern inquiry. She turned this over for a moment and understood what it was, not a man trying to protect himself, because a voluntary statement to a hospital didn't provide legal protection. And a man trying to protect himself would have called a lawyer by now. And the note in her pocket and this development both pointed in the same direction, toward a man who had come apart in the specific way that some people did when the accumulation of a single day exceeded their architecture for carrying it. She didn't go to the desk. She didn't need to. This was not her process to manage. Tell Tom, she said to Patrick. Let it run. She finished her charts. At 5:23, the administrative corridor door opened and Thomas Wren came through it with the expression of a man who had had the most complex administrative afternoon of his career and was not entirely sure it was over. He came directly to the nurse's station. He gave a full statement, Wren said quietly, so only Claire heard him. He documented the assault from his own account. He acknowledged the escalation. He acknowledged prior incidents of his language was inappropriate use of authority in civilian contexts. He named the Castillo situation without being asked. He paused. He said he didn't know if it would matter. He said he wanted it in the record regardless. Claire absorbed this. Has legal seen it? They're with him now. Wren looked at her. The IG is going to receive a copy of this statement as supplementary documentation within the hour. He paused again. I've been doing this job for 11 years, Claire. I have never had an officer voluntarily submit documentation against himself. On the same day, a complaint was filed. He's not a bad person, she said. Wren looked at her with something that approached surprise. He did a bad thing, she said. More than one. In this building and in others. He needs to answer for them, and he is answering for them. That's not the same as being irredeemable. She looked at the corridor. His brother has a mass in his lung. He's going to need someone capable of sitting in a family corridor without ego getting in the way. She picked up a chart. I hope he figures out how. Wren stood for a moment. Then he said, You're a complicated person, Claire. I'm a nurse, she said. We all are. She finished the last of her documentation at 5:31 and clocked out at 5:38, which was technically 38 minutes late, but was not unusual and was not worth noting. She collected her bag from her locker. She took out the citation folded into quarters now and the letter from Joel, and she held them for a moment. She put them both in her bag. She put on her jacket. Renner was in the hallway outside the locker room. He wasn't waiting with any display of it. He was looking at his phone, leaning against the opposite wall, with the easy patience of someone who had spent years in situations that required waiting and had made his peace with it. He looked up when she came out. "I'll walk you out," he said, which was not a question. She looked at him. He was 60-something, broad, with the empty service folder under one arm and the expression of a man who had delivered what he'd carried for 6 years and was now in the unfamiliar position of not having anything to carry. "All right," she said. They walked through the corridor and through the swinging doors and through the ER waiting area and out through the main entrance into the late afternoon in Calverton, Ohio, where the light was the specific amber of early September at 5:30, the kind of light that made even a hospital parking structure look like something a photographer had composed. They stood on the concrete apron outside the entrance. "Where are you staying?" she said. "Hotel by the highway. We drove up this morning." "You should eat," she said. "The sandwich place on Mercer stays open until 8. It's not remarkable, but it's actual food. That's a recommendation." "It's a fact," she said. "Take it as you like." He almost smiled. "Not quite. Will you be all right?" he said. "Tonight, when the day settles." She considered the question honestly, which was the only way she'd ever known how to consider questions. "I'll be fine," she said. "I'll probably be angry later, when the adrenaline's completely gone. That's normal." She looked at the parking structure. "And I'll read the letter again. The parts I need to." He nodded. She started to go. Then she stopped. "The letter," she said. "The last paragraph." "I don't know what it says," Renner said quickly. "He wrote it privately. He sealed it." I know," she said. "I'm not telling you what it says." She looked at him. "I'm just telling you it's the right thing." He looked at her, and something in his face moved toward a question he didn't ask, and then moved back. He seemed to know that whatever the last paragraph said, she would hold it the way she held everything, without broadcasting it, without making it smaller, and without forgetting it. "Okay," he said. "Drive safe," she said. She turned and walked toward the employee lot, and she had gone 20 feet when her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out. An unknown number, Ohio area code, and when she answered it, the voice on the other end was a woman's voice, careful and a little tight, in the way of someone who had been working up to making a call for some time, and was now committed. "Is this Claire Voss?" The woman said. "Yes. My name is Diane Castillo." A pause. "I was told today that my complaint had been reopened. They gave me your name, as they said you were the person whose case connected to mine." Another pause. "I don't even know why I'm calling. I found the hospital number, and I called the main desk, and they put me through to a nurse on the floor, and the nurse gave me your cell." That would be Sandra, Claire thought. She would have words with Sandra about that. Later. "Ms. Castillo," she said. She stopped walking. "I'm glad you called. They told me about today," Castillo said. "What he did. In the hospital." Her voice had something in it that was not quite anger and not quite relief, something between, some specific emotion that didn't have a clean word. "I want you to know when I withdrew my complaint, I didn't..." She stopped. "I want you to know I knew I was right. I just didn't have..." "You didn't have documentation," Claire said. "And you were alone. And they moved you." A silence. "Yes," Castillo said. "You have documentation now," Claire said. "And you're not alone. And they cannot move you again for something that happened 14 months ago." She said it plainly, not as a speech, just as the factual assessment it was. "The IG is going to contact you. When they do, I'd encourage you to speak to them. That's your decision to make." "I know it's my decision." Castillo's voice had steadied slightly. I wanted to know if you..." She stopped again. Then she said simply, "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Claire said. "The process is the process. It takes time and it's not always clean." She started walking again, slowly, toward the lot. "But the record looks different now than it did this morning. That part is real." She ended the call. She stood beside her car in the employee lot for a moment, With the September light going amber around her, and the ambient sound of the hospital behind her, and the folded letter and the folded citation, both in her bag, and she thought about Diane Castillo in a posting 3 states away, and Joel Renner in a letter sealed for 6 years, and Russell Aldine with a mass in his lung, and Warren Aldine in an administrative corridor giving a voluntary statement he hadn't been asked to give. She thought about the morning, the walk to the admissions desk, the calculation in Aldine's eyes when he'd looked at her, the sound the strike had made. She got in her car. She was pulling out of the lot when her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a number she recognized, the extension for Wren's office. She answered on the second ring. Tom. One more thing, Wren said, and then I will let you go home. His voice had the flat exhaustion of someone at the end of a long day, trying to be precise anyway. The IG's office called again. 20 minutes ago. She waited. They've contacted the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, Wren said. The Castillo complaint, plus today's assault, combined with the voluntary statement, as they said, the characterization has been elevated. A pause. Conduct unbecoming is no longer the operative charge, Claire. They're opening a formal criminal investigation into abuse of authority and coercion. The CID will be conducting interviews starting tomorrow. She pulled to the lot exit and stopped. His command authority? She said. Suspended, pending the investigation. As of an hour ago. Wren's voice was careful. He doesn't know yet. They're going to notify him tonight. She sat at the lot exit, and the amber light, with her hands on the wheel and the weight of the day distributed through her body in the specific way it distributed itself after days that had required everything. Thank you, Tom, she said. Go home, he said. Please. She turned onto the street. The hospital disappeared in her rearview mirror, though she knew exactly what it still held. Russell Aldine in Bay 5, with his numbers holding Warren Aldine in a corridor, about to receive a phone call that would end his evening and begin a process that would take months. Dale Renner, somewhere on the highway, with an empty folder and a full piece of what he'd been carrying, and Sandra on the floor, keeping 14 things running at once, because that was what Sandra did. She drove 2 blocks. 3. The evening traffic of Calverton, Ohio, moved around her car, indifferent and ordinary. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it at the next red light. A text from a number she didn't recognize. Different area code than Castillo. Different from anyone she'd spoken with today. The message was 4 words. We need to talk. Below it, a second message, arriving while she looked at the first. It's about Renner, Dale Renner, and what he didn't tell you. The light changed. The car behind her moved. She sat still for 1 second longer than she should have, staring at her phone, while the amber light of the early September evening fell through the windshield of her car in the parking lot of a Tuesday in Calverton, Ohio, and the message on her phone sat waiting with the patient, absolute certainty of something that had been coming for a long time and had finally decided it was done waiting. She sat at the red light for 3 seconds past the green, which was long enough for the car behind her to offer a short, impatient horn. And then she pulled forward and drove to the end of the block and turned into the parking lot of a dry cleaner and turned into the parking lot of Com that had closed at 5 and sat in the still of a car that had stopped moving. She read the messages again. We need to talk. It's about Renner, Dale Renner, and what he didn't tell you. She looked at the number. Ohio area code, but different from Castillo's. Different from anyone she'd spoken with today. Different from any number in her contacts. She sat with it for a moment, running through the architecture of the day, every conversation. Every person who had come and gone through Wellstone General in the last 11 hours, and she tried locate to where this number could have originated and came up with nothing clean. She called it back. It rang 4 times and went to a voicemail that had not been set up. The automated message telling her the mailbox was not yet configured, and she ended the call and sat in the dry cleaner parking lot and thought. There were two categories of person who could send a message like that. The first was someone with genuine information, someone who knew Renner, knew what had happened today, and had something to add to it that Renner had chosen not to. The second was someone running a different game entirely, using what had happened today as leverage, using Renner's name as a key to get her to engage. She had been, in a previous chapter of her life, in situations where distinguishing between those two categories had mattered in ways that had no equivalence in a hospital setting. She applied the same framework now. Unknown number. No voicemail. Message sent after business hours. On the same day, a military assault complaint and a criminal investigation had been opened. The timing was not coincidental. She texted back, "Who is this?" No question mark. She'd learned a long time ago that questions gave information about what you didn't know, and what you didn't know was the only leverage you had in a situation you didn't yet understand terrain. The response came in 40 seconds. "My name is Victor Greer. I'm an attorney. I represent Diane Castillo. She called me after she spoke to you tonight. I have information about Dale Renner that Ms. Castillo became aware of during her original complaint process. It affects your situation. I'd like to speak with you tonight, if possible." She read it twice. Then she called Victor Greer. He picked up on the first ring, which told her he'd been holding the phone. "Ms. Voss." His voice was even and precise, the voice of a man who measured his words as a professional habit. "Thank you for calling back. Tell me what you have," she said. In the course of investigating Ms. Castillo's original complaint, 14 months ago before it was closed, when she still believed the process would work, she obtained access to certain procurement documentation. Records from Fort Bellman. Among those records was a communications log that included correspondence between Lieutenant Colonel Aldine and a senior enlisted advisor. A pause. The advisor is referenced by name in the log. The name is Dale Renner. The dry cleaner parking lot was very quiet. "What kind of correspondence?" she said. Aldine was requesting Renner's assistance in validating a contractor's billing submission. Renner had some tangential relationship with the contractor's project, a training contract, I believe, involving K9 unit procurement and handler certification. The log shows Aldine asked Renner to provide a supporting statement characterizing the contractor's performance as satisfactory. Greer's voice was careful. The contractor's billing submission was the same one. Miss Castillo was pressured to approve, the same one that initiated her original complaint. Claire sat in the still car. "Did Renner provide the statement?" she said. "That's what I don't know," Greer said. "Miss Castillo has the communications log, but not the resolution. The complaint was closed before she could obtain follow-up documentation." He paused. "What I know is that Dale Renner's name appears in a record connected to Warren Aldine's conduct, and Renner came to your hospital today to participate in a proceeding that publicly humiliated Aldine and supported a complaint against him." Another pause. "I don't know what that means. I'm not a person who jumps to conclusions about what things mean. But Ms. Castillo felt you should know, and I agreed with her." Claire looked through the windshield at the closed storefront across the lot. Hand-lettered hours on the glass, a closed sign, the specific vacancy of a small business at the end of a day. "How long have you represented Ms. Castillo?" she said. "Since the complaint was closed. She retained me in case the process reopened." "And today it reopened." "Today it reopened," he confirmed, "which is why she called me immediately after speaking with you. And why I'm calling you now." She thought about Renner in the stairwell, the way he'd sat on the second step from the bottom, the empty folder in his hands. "Joel asked me to say it in front of other people, because he said you'd minimize it." She thought about the walk out of the hospital, the amber light, the comment about Sandra's terrible coffee. She thought about the last paragraph of Joel's letter, the part she'd told him was the right thing, without telling him what it said. "I need to verify the documentation," she said. "I expected that. I can send you copies tonight. Email or secure file transfer, your preference." Email is fine. She gave him her address. I'll look at it tonight. I'll call you tomorrow, Ms. Voss. He paused. I want to be clear about something. This information doesn't change what happened today. What the Vice Admiral said. What Renner said in that hallway. Whatever Joel Renner experienced and whatever his father did or didn't do 14 months ago in a procurement process, those are separate things. His voice was steady. I'm telling you this because you deserve to have the full picture, not because it should undo the rest. I know the difference, she said. I thought you would, he said. Good night, Ms. Voss. She drove home. Her apartment was on the 4th floor of a building on the west side of Calverton that had been built in the 70s and had not been substantially updated since, which meant the elevator was unreliable, and the water pressure in the shower was excellent. She had lived there for 3 years. It had a front window that looked out on an intersection, a back window that looked out on another building's brick wall. And she had hung nothing on the walls except a topographic map of a region she did not name when people asked, and a small shelf near the door that held her keys, and a photograph she had printed from her. Phoned 2 years ago and framed in a plain black frame. The photograph was of a group of people in field gear, squinting into bright light in front of a vehicle that was not identifiable. She was in it, far left, younger by 10 years and several hundred experiences. Joel Renner was in it, third from the right, caught mid-sentence in the way that photographs sometimes captured people, mouth slightly open, eyes on something outside the frame. She looked at it when she came through the door, the way she always looked at it, briefly, deliberately, then moved on. She changed out of her scrubs. She made tea because she had learned in the last 5 years that what she wanted at the end of a hard day was usually not what was good for her, and tea was the negotiated compromise she'd arrived at. She opened her laptop. Victor Greer's email had arrived. She opened the attachment. The procurement communications log was 14 pages. She read all of it. Renner's name appeared on page 7 in an email chain from 16 months ago, 2 months before Castillo filed her original complaint. Aldine had written to Renner directly, referencing a K-9 handler certification contract at Fort Belman, and asking him to provide a written characterization of the contractor's performance for a billing validation. The email was specific, formatted, the kind of communication that a man sent when he expected compliance. Renner's response was on page 8. She read it 3 times. Warren, I've reviewed the documentation you sent, and I can't provide the characterization you're asking for. The contractor's delivery on the handler certification program was below standard on 2 of the 3 metrics. I'm not going to put my name on something that says otherwise. You know me better than that. Don't ask again. That was all. No elaboration, no negotiation. A flat refusal in writing 16 months ago. Below it, Aldine's response, 2 sentences. Understood. We'll find another way. She closed the document. She sat at her kitchen table with her tea and thought about Dale Renner, who had refused Warren Aldine in writing 16 months ago, which meant that Renner had direct, documented knowledge that Aldine was involved in procurement irregularities, and who had come to her hospital today with a sealed folder and a letter and had stood in a hallway and said what he said and had not mentioned in any of it. She understood why. She didn't like it, but she understood it. Renner had kept the procurement refusal to himself because it was not his story to tell. It was Castillo's, and Castillo's complaint had been closed and surfacing. It would have required him to involve himself in a legal process that hadn't asked for him. He had come to the hospital today for one reason, which was Joel, and which was the letter, and he had done what he'd come to do. Everything else was a separate matter, and he had kept it separate. The question of whether he should have told her was the kind of question that had an answer, that depended entirely on what you believed people owed each other in situations where the orbits of their separate histories had collided by accident. She picked up her phone. She called Renner's number, which she had because Commander Watt had given all contact information to Sandra before they'd left, and Sandra had sent it to Claire without being asked. He picked up on the second ring. Road noise in the background, which meant he was still driving. Voss, he said, not surprised. Either he'd been expecting the call or he had the particular steadiness of a man who had stopped being surprised by things. I spoke to Victor Greer tonight, she said. He represents Diane Castillo. A pause, 2 seconds. 3. All right, he said. I read the communications log, page 7 and 8. Another pause. Then he said, I should have told you. Yes, she said. I didn't come there today to involve myself in the procurement case. That was hers to pursue. I had no right to make it mine. I know that, she said. I also know that you have documentation that the IG's office doesn't have yet. A written refusal in your name, connecting Aldine directly to the pressure on Castillo. She let that land. That's not nothing, Renner. That's the chain of evidence they need to close the loop. A long silence. Road noise. If I submit that, he said, I become a witness in a criminal investigation. Yes, into a man whose brother is currently in your hospital with a lung mass. Those are separate things, she said. Greer's word, back out of her mouth, because it was the right word. Russell's care is not conditional on anything Warren does or doesn't answer for. That's not how this works. Not in my building. Another silence. Joel would have told you, Renner said. Not as a deflection, as a fact. Arrived at plainly. He would have said it in the parking lot on the way out. Probably. He was never good at sitting on things. No, she said. He wasn't. I'll contact the IG tomorrow, Renner said. First thing. I'll let Greer know, she said. Voss. His voice had changed slightly, something underneath it that she'd heard before in the stairwell when he'd been at the bottom of the thing. Does this change what happened today? Does it change it for you? She thought about the letter in her bag. The last paragraph. The specific thing Joel had written in the sloping handwriting on the ruled paper that she was not going to repeat out loud to anyone, including his father. No, she said. It doesn't change it. She heard him exhale. It was a small sound and it had a lot in it. Drive safe, she said. You said that to me already. It applies twice, she said, and ended the call. She sat at her kitchen table until the tea was cold. Then she went to bed, and she slept without difficulty, because she had learned in a previous life that sleep was not a reward and not a luxury, but an operational requirement, and that the body needed it regardless of what the mind was carrying, and her body had carried a great deal today and needed it. She was back at Wellstone General at 6 a.m. Not because she had to be. Derek Malone was back from his sick day, his kid's fever broken, and her shift didn't start until 7. She came in at 6 because the rhythm of the place was different, at 6 quieter in the specific way that allowed for clarity, and because there were things she wanted to do before the floor fully woke up. She went first to Bay 5. Russell Aldine was asleep. His oxygen saturation read 95. His respiratory rate was calm, and even on the monitor. The room had the specific stillness of early morning in a hospital, which was different all other kinds of stillness. She stood in the doorway and looked at his numbers and confirmed in her own body that they were what they needed to be. Then she updated his chart with the overnight notes and left him to sleep. She went to the nurse's station and found the night charge, a quiet man named Theo Brandt, who ran the overnight floor with the unhurried competence of someone who had been doing this for 20 years and had no interest in recognition for any of it. How was the night, she said. He said, Bay 5 held. The 2 trauma patients upstairs are both stable. You had a good day yesterday. She looked at him. The mass, he said. Bay 5. Navarro told the overnight team to flag it as a caught finding. He said it plainly, without ceremony. We keep track of those. The ones that got found because someone pushed. She nodded. She went to get coffee. At 7:45, with the morning shift fully in motion and the floor running at its normal organized noise, Thomas Wren appeared at the nurse's station with the expression of a man delivering something he'd been sitting on since the night before. The Army notified Aldine last night. he said. His command authority has been formally suspended pending the CID investigation. He's been ordered to remain available for interview. He paused. He's not coming back to this building. Russell is still here, she said. He can visit as a family member, not as he won't come in here the way he came in yesterday. Wren's voice was certain in a way it hadn't been at any point during the previous day. Legal confirmed the restriction extends to all clinical areas for the duration of the investigation. Russell is going to need family during whatever comes next with the pulmonology workup, she said. I know. We'll work it out. Wren looked at her. The hospital board is meeting next week. They're going to address the incident formally. They'll want your account. They'll have it. There will also be, he paused. They're considering a formal commendation for the way you handled the floor yesterday. The trauma response, the Bay 5 catch, and he stopped. All of it. She looked at him. Tell them I don't need a commendation, Tom. I know you don't need it, he said. That's not why they're doing it. He said it with a directness she hadn't heard from him often. They're doing it because the record should show what happened here yesterday. All of it. Not just the assault. Not just the military ceremony. The whole thing. The 4 trauma patients you stabilized. The imaging catch. The statement you gave. The way you went back to work every single time. He held her gaze. That belongs in the record, too. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, tell them to keep it short. He almost smiled. I'll tell them exactly that. 2 weeks passed. They passed the way time passed, in emergency medicine, not in a straight line, but in the layered, overlapping way of shifts in patients and cases that opened and closed and occasionally left marks. Russell Dean's bronchoscopy confirmed a stage 2 adenocarcinoma. It was operable. The oncology team at Wellstone General put together a plan, and Russell, who had spent his life being the quieter brother in the shadow of a louder one, approached the diagnosis with a composed practicality that surprised everyone except Claire, who had watched him be underestimated from his first morning in Bay 5. Warren Aldine came to 2 of Russell's follow-up appointments. He came quietly, without uniform, and he sat in the family corridor and waited to be called in and did not speak to any clinical staff unless spoken to first. Claire saw him once in the hallway, and they looked at each other, and he nodded, and she nodded, and they went their separate directions. It was not forgiveness, exactly. It was the particular acknowledgement of 2 people whose lives had intersected violently and who were now navigating the geography that remained. The CID investigation moved forward. Renner submitted his documentation, the written refusal, the email chain, 16 months of paper that he had kept, because he was a man who kept things precisely for the reason that came, because you never knew when the day would arrive, when the record would matter. Diane Castillo gave a full statement from her posting 3 states away, and this time there was no reviewing officer with a prior relationship to the subject, and there was no reassignment waiting at the end of it. The preliminary findings of the CID investigation were issued 6 weeks after the day at Wellstone General. Warren Aldine was formally charged with abuse of authority, coercion of a civilian employee, and conduct unbecoming an officer. He was separated from active duty pending the outcome of the proceedings. The Article 32 hearing was scheduled for the following spring. His career, which he had spent 22 years building and had wielded like a shield in every room he'd entered, was over in every practical sense before any verdict was rendered. Not because of the hearing, because of the record. Because the record now existed in full: the Castillo complaint, the procurement communications, the camera footage from Bay 5, the voluntary statement he'd given in Wren's office, the IG's pattern finding, and records. Unlike the authority of rank, did not negotiate and did not yield to volume. The Navy's formal commendation ceremony for Claire Voss was held on a Thursday morning in the conference room at Wellstone General, the same conference room where she had sat across from Strom and Watt and Renner 3 weeks earlier, the one with the whiteboard still showing discharge protocol notes in blue marker. They had not asked if she wanted a larger venue. She had made her preference clear through Watt, who had the specific useful quality of conveying preferences to flag officers without softening them. 14 people were in the room: Sandra, Patrick, Amara, Dr. Navarro, Thomas Wren, two of the overnight nurses who had specifically asked to be there and had rearranged their sleep schedules to do it, the hospital's chief medical officer, a woman named Dr. Lenora Park, who had gray hair and had worked in emergency medicine for 30 years, and who stood in the back of the room with the expression of someone watching something she had not seen before and intended to remember. Vice Admiral Strom read the citation. He read it in full, without abbreviation, which meant it took 7 minutes, and the room was quiet for all of them. The citation was specific in its language, not the general language of institutional valor, but the particular language of particular events: the ditch, the 18 minutes, the limited equipment, the enemy fire that had not moved her from the work that wasn't done. It named the date and the location, which had been declassified for the purpose, and it named what she had done in plain operational terms that left no room for understatement. When he finished, he looked up. "The Navy remembers," he said. He extended his hand. She shook it. Her hand was steady. Her face was doing the internal work it did, the compression that was not suppression, but management. And she let it do that work, because she had long since made peace with the fact that feeling something completely and showing it completely were not the same obligation. Then Renner stepped forward. He was in full uniform again, anchors precise, the specific gravity of a man who had put the uniform back on because the occasion asked for it, and not for any other reason. He looked at her and said nothing for a moment, which was fine, because there are some moments that are complete without language. Then he said, "He'd have hated how formal this is." She said, "He'd have complained about the chairs." Renner made the sound again, the one from the stairwell, somewhere between a laugh and something else, and this time it lasted a half-second longer. "Thank you," he said, "not for the commendation, not for the process. For the specific thing that couldn't be put on a citation, the thing that had happened in a ditch in the dark when his son was scared, and the work wasn't done and she had stayed." "I know," she said. She meant, "I know it's not enough, and I know it's everything you have, and I know what it cost you to carry it here, and I know what Joel said in the last paragraph. And in the last paragraph summits, none of this makes the missing okay, but some of it makes the weight bearable, and that is not nothing. And I will hold it the same way I hold everything." She meant all of that and said none of it, because she had never needed many words when the right ones were already understood. Dr. Park spoke briefly at the end. She said what the day deserved to have said about it, that the work of a nurse was not lesser for being done in scrubs rather than in uniform, that the courage required to do what was right in the middle of a hostile situation was courage regardless of the setting, and so that Wellstone General would carry the record of this day as a standard, not as an exception. She said it without flourish, and without the hollow ring of words assembled for the occasion. And because of that, it landed the way it was meant to. The room applauded. Claire stood in the center of it, and let the sound exist around her, and did not deflect it, and did not perform gratitude. She didn't feel, because she did feel it, not for the certificate or the citation or the handshake, but for the people in the room, the ones who had been on the floor that day and had kept it running and had filed their statements and had stood in a hallway and witnessed a truth that most of them hadn't known they were part of. After, Sandra hugged her. Sandra was not typically a hugger and did it with the slight awkwardness of someone operating outside their default, which made it the most honest version of a hug Claire had received in recent memory. "Don't get weird about it," Sandra said into her shoulder. "I'm not getting weird about it." "Good." Sandra let go. Stepped back. Her eyes were doing the thing they did when Sandra was managing something she wasn't going to name. "You're on bay rotation today. Bay 3 is yours." "I know," Claire said. "Mrs. Etheridge came back in yesterday," Sandra said. Chest tightness. "Turned out to be anxiety. She's fine." but she asked if you were on shift. What did you tell her? I told her you were in a meeting, but you'd be back. Claire looked at her. I told her the truth, Sandra said, with the specific brand of Sandra practicality that was its own kind of warmth. Claire went to Bay 3. Marguerite Etheridge was sitting up in the bed with the television off, and her hands folded in her lap. And when Claire came through the curtain, she looked up, and her face did the thing that faces did when someone arrived, who they had been genuinely hoping to see. There you are, Marguerite said. Here I am, Claire said. She checked the monitor. Normal sinus. Blood pressure appropriate. Oxygen saturation 98. How are you feeling? Better than yesterday. Yesterday I panicked about something, and apparently my body decided to make it everyone's problem. She shook her head at herself. 30 years teaching 14-year-olds, and I can't manage my own anxiety. 14-year-olds are a specific kind of training, Claire said. Marguerite smiled. I heard there was some kind of event this morning. For a nurse. She looked at Claire with the quiet perceptiveness of someone who had spent 30 years reading rooms. Was that you? Yes, Claire said. What did they honor you for? Claire made a note in the chart. Something I did a long time ago, she said. Something good? She looked at Marguerite Etheridge, 63 years old, retired schoolteacher, chest tightness from anxiety. 9 years of students who had grown up and gone on, and carried something of her forward into the world without knowing it, the way teachers' students always did. I kept someone alive long enough for something to matter, Claire said. Marguerite looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, That sounds like exactly the right kind of work. It is, Claire said. She finished the chart note. She tucked the pen back into her breast pocket, where the citation had rested the day before, folded into quarters. It was at home now on the shelf beside the photograph, in a plain frame she'd bought at the pharmacy on the way home from the ceremony, nothing elaborate, just something to hold it, because it deserved to be held. She pulled the curtain behind her on the way out and stepped back onto the floor. The R was moving the way it always moved the organized noise, the monitors, the particular density of a space where things happened quickly and mattered immediately and required the full presence of everyone working in it. Sandra was at the station. Patrick was coming out of Bay 7. Amara was on the phone. Theo Brandt's overnight notes were still on the board in the specific shorthand of a man who wrote for the people who came after him, not for himself. Claire Voss stood at the nurse's station and looked at the board and picked up the next chart and went to work. Not because anyone was watching, not because the record required it, or the certificate demanded it, or the citation described it. Because there was a patient in Bay 4 who needed someone who knew what they were doing, and she knew what she was doing, and she had known it long before anyone in this building had understood what that meant. The power had never been in the title or the uniform or the rank. It had been in the room the whole time, wearing navy scrubs, rolling her sleeves to the elbow, staying when it would have been easier to go. That was the part no one could take away. Not the strike, not the dismissal, not the long years of being underestimated in hallways that didn't know her history. The strength had never needed an audience. It had only ever needed the next patient. She pushed through the Bay 4 curtain and introduced herself, and the work, ordinary, essential. Hers began again.